Jeff, do you think we should start? And then, this will start with a general introduction, and then folks will be able to come in as we start our conversation. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, ready to rock.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I must admit that I am a little bit nervous today. And it's funny because I have done this several times, but it's such an honor to have you here, Jeff. So thank you so much for being here. And I'll try to breathe between just to make sure that I don't talk too fast. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the Teaching to Transgress speaker series. My name is Yasmin Jerbal, and I am an educational developer in anti-racist pedagogies and inclusion here at the Center for Teaching and Learning at Queen's University. And before we start, I would like to think with you about what it means that Kingston, the city where I am joining you from today, and Queen's University, my place of work, occupy the territories of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. A territory that is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, a treaty that committed these nations to share the territory in peace, in friendship, and respect, with each nation maintaining its distinct sovereignty, and where all newcomers are invited into this treaty and in the spirit of those obligations. The way that I have been taught about the symbolism of the Dish with One Spoon treaty is that we all eat out of the dish, all of us that share this territory, with only one spoon. In other words, we have to share the responsibility of ensuring that the dish is never empty, which includes taking care of the land and the creatures we share with it. And importantly, there are no knives at the table, meaning that we must keep the peace. As we continuously get drawn back into global catastrophes and economic recessions and the prices of basic commodities that keep on going up, I think it's really important to remember this responsibility we all share to ensuring the dish is never empty and to taking care of the land and the creatures we share with it. Relatedly, I think it's really important for us to consider how we can think of our commitment to live in solidarity, in friendship, and respect on the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, all the while fighting for Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous self-determination. And here I'd like to pause for a few seconds for you to also reflect on these questions and how you would perhaps answer them. The Center for Teaching and Learning is the central academic service unit that promotes and supports quality teaching while building capacity in teaching and educational leadership in direct support of Queen's students' learning experiences. You can find more about what we do at our website, which will also be shared in the chat at www.queensu.ca-CTL. And the speaker series is inspired by scholar, educator, and activist Bell Hooks' critical work on liberatory practices and pedagogy. In her book, Teaching to Transgress, Education as the Practice for Freedom, Bell Hooks encourages us to think of the classroom as a space to transgress boundaries, a space that connects the quote-unquote will to know with the will to become. To her, engaged education is the practice for freedom, and the classroom a space where liberatory practices can be imagined and rehearsed. And inspired by her work and her legacy, the Teaching to Transgress speaker series features radical thinkers, practitioners, and pedagogues to foster the exchange of critical and innovative pedagogies and teaching practices. And instead of a regular presentation, we really want to be in conversation with our guests, think with them about their teaching philosophies and practices and the political commitments they bring to their work and values they use to frame their teaching and their research. And I think that to me, a lot of these conversations are often held behind closed doors, and we really want to open the opportunity to have these conversations together. And so please note that this session will be recorded, and the chat and video, as well as the sound, will be disabled until we open it up for the Q&A. Closed captioning has been turned on. And if you have any questions that come to mind during the first part of the presentation, please do take note of them to share them later. So I come now to finally present Jeff, and it is my absolute honor. And again, like I'm feeling a little bit nervous. I hope I wasn't talking too fast, but it is my immense pleasure to welcome Professor Jeff Preston, Assistant Professor and Department Chair in Disability Studies at King's College at Western University. And Jeff's work focuses on the intersection of disability, subjectivity, biopower, and culture. He completed a master's in media studies where he wrote about disability and the body. And his thesis was entitled Augmented Ability, Integrated Identity, Understanding Sapienism, Adaptive Technology, and the Construction of Disability. And just the title sounds amazing and fascinating. And in 2014, he completed a doctorate in media studies as well, successfully defending his dissertation on fantasizing disability, representation of loss and limitation in popular television and film. And Jeff's first book, The Fantasy of Disability, was published by Routledge in 2016. So Jeff, it is a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And I wanted to start with the first question by inviting you to tell us a little bit more about your teaching trajectory and who are some of the thinkers and practices that have influenced you as an educator today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yasmin, for having me, and for everyone coming to listen to this conversation. It's sort of long been said, the trick is not to get me started talking; it's to get me to stop. So we will see how this goes. I might be the one who's talking a bit too much. So I will try to be brief when possible, but I have lots of things to say. So I think I've been thinking about this question about my teaching trajectory, and I think as my tradition, I want to sort of go on a bit of a story, a bit of a journey, because I think that where I ended up and how I ended up as a professor is a winding story that, in hindsight, I think makes a ton of sense, and everything is like, well, yeah, I guess maybe everything was leading to this all along. But it wasn't something that I ever really felt that I knew that this is what I wanted to do or what I wanted to be until I got to university. So I think when we think about trajectory, I think we have to start with the way that I first engaged or first entered into the world of education, which was as a little boy, entering into the public education system and being immediately designated as a problem. I had been diagnosed almost right at birth, but 3 months in, with a rare form of muscular dystrophy, which meant that I would use a wheelchair. I've never been able to walk, very weak in all 4 limbs. And when I first arrived at school, I very quickly learned that I wasn't like the other children. And it wasn't because the other children didn't use wheelchairs, but it was because the system I was entering fundamentally saw me as different than them. I was a, quote, exceptionality. I was a problem. I was a problem because I wasn't able to board the bus. I was a problem because I couldn't write by hand in the same way. I was a problem because I didn't play the sports that people were playing in gym class. I was a problem because I couldn't go out in the snow or in the cold during the winter for recess. And in all of these sort of steps, every sort of place we went, I was reminded constantly that these spaces were not designed for me, did not expect me to be in them, and that it was sort of my responsibility to try to bend my body to fit within the rigid structure that had been placed in front of me. Which meant that I had to learn from a really young age to be an advocate, how to speak for myself. This is something my parents raised me to do, and did, I would say, a very, very good job of doing. So much so that I was then drawn into the world of charity. I was a pretty good speaker. I made my first public talk, so to speak, when I was about 3 years old at a charity volleyball tournament. And that was kind of the beginning of the end. I suddenly was swept into this world of fundraising where I was the cute poster boy, and I would talk about my experience and how you need to donate money in order to find a cure for muscular dystrophy, and doing the television thing and all of that. And it's interesting because as I was doing that work, I was learning how to talk. I was learning how to present publicly. I was learning about like marketing things like emotional appeal. But I was also learning that there was a power in speaking, that there was a power in showing people the types of things that I was experiencing and how my words could have an impact, that they could actually change the way that people thought about or saw the world. And so I think in some ways, that was maybe how it kind of got started for me, that I realized in the charity role, my job wasn't just about raising money, but was also about education. It was about teaching people and being a voice that is often not heard in public spaces at that time. I think if I look at people that have really influenced me in my life as an educator, for me, I think the personal is always political, but so too are the inspirations. And so I think about in high school, I had an English teacher named Mr. Devereaux, and Mr. Devereaux understood that I was not a very good student, that I didn't like school, that school was kind of boring to me, and I would much rather be playing on my computer. I wasn't really interested. But he saw something in me, and he saw that I was really drawn into the writing of George Orwell. Really, really big fan of 1984 as a kid. And I remember Mr. Devereaux starting to assign me these other books that weren't a part of the curriculum. But it's like, oh, if you like that, why don't you read this? And if you really like that, why don't you write something about it? And I remember he got me into Margaret Atwood. He gave me Handmaid's Tale. And it was a really important book, I think, for me as a teenage boy to read. It was a different story than what I was seeing in popular culture. And so I was doing these essays and these think pieces about these books that were not actually on the curriculum. And I think what I learned from Mr. Devereaux is that unengaged students, or students that are maybe struggling to really fit within the classroom, perhaps it's because the curriculum itself is not what that student needs at that time. And that maybe you need to change things, maybe you need to adapt things for individual students, which is something I've tried to carry with me. Another, I would say, a huge influence, huge impact on my life was a prof at Western, a professor named Dr. Tim Blackmore, who in first year, he taught the first year media studies class. And I remember, I think it was like week 2 or 3, I'm listening to him lecture, and it's like this light clicked on. And I said to myself, this is what I want to do. I want to be like this. I want to be like him. And that was when I decided I wanted to do a PhD when I was in my first year of my undergrad. And I was lucky enough to work with Dr. Blackmore as well as TA for Dr. Blackmore. And I have to say that everything that I learned about being a teacher, I really did learn from him. He taught me that being a teacher is not about being the sage on stage. It's not about the person behind the lectern, but rather the role of the teacher, the role of the instructor, the professor is to be of service, to be of service to the students. That it isn't your show, it's theirs. And your job is to facilitate that experience. He gave so much of himself to his students, continues to give so much of himself to his students. And that, I think, was really inspirational to me. It really inspired me to be a different kind of professor, to build a different kind of classroom. And then I think if we look to the world of sort of disability studies and critical theory, obviously, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Freire was an amazing book for me to read. Bell Hook's work is obviously very, very important. And I think also just the scrappy disability justice type folk who were writing these stories, legitimizing experiences of disability and saying that we are maybe not the problem. Maybe it's the system that's the problem. Maybe it's the structures or the attitudes that's the problem, that maybe I don't need to change. Maybe the world is the thing that needs to be adapted. And perhaps it's not just me who doesn't fit, but maybe many, many, many of us don't fit. I think all of these kind of points start to come together to influence who I am and what it is that I try to do for students in my classroom, and also outside of the classroom.
Thank you so much. And, you know, it's interesting that you talk about this progression from a public speaker to instructor. And I think that, as you know, educators are thought of, some of them, as great speakers, you know, that really capture people's attention and can really bring in information in ways that are accessible and that everyone can understand. And so in thinking about your teaching philosophy, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how your teaching philosophy has progressed through time and how perhaps your students have informed it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's interesting, the sort of retrospective, right? When you think about, you know, the first class that I taught on my own was in 2014 at Western, and then when I look at sort of where I am now, I would say absolutely, I was a lot more energetic back then in 2014. Time is cruel, I think, to all of us. I'm a little sleepier than I was back then, for sure. But I think that there was some pieces there that I was starting to put together that have been evolving, and I think have really become something that I'm a lot more proud of now than when I first started. One thing that I think that really stands out to me was in the early days of teaching, when I first started as a TA, and then moving on into teaching my own courses, I felt that it was really important to give voice to and to immediately address the fact that I was disabled in my classroom, which of course is not, I mean, it would be hard for you to not figure it out. The 300-pound wheelchair is a bit of a giveaway. It kind of stands out a little bit. Or maybe I'm just a very good liar. I don't know. And so I felt that I needed to address it, right? And so in the first day of class, you know, and I'm going to try not to summon the ghost of Irving Goffman right now, but I would sort of approach it with humor. And I would often say to students, I'd be like, you know, you may or may not have noticed, but I am a disabled person, and I use a wheelchair as a result. And there are times during this class where I will need you to help me with things. If I were to say drop something, I might need help picking it up. And that is a different relationship than maybe you're used to. But, you know, I would go to the humor side and be like, you know, remember, I'm the one marking your papers. So, you know, if you wouldn't mind writing for me on the board, that would be much appreciated. And it was kind of this playful thing, but it felt like something that I felt needed to be addressed, because I felt if I didn't, there would be these kind of lingering questions. There would be this awkwardness that would sort of exist between me and the students, because there'd be this thing that they maybe wanted to know about, because people always want to know about it, but probably wouldn't feel comfortable asking, and that could be a problem. And so that's how I first started it. I figured, let's address the elephant in the room. And that maybe there's power in that. Maybe there's power in kind of owning it. And I think that there can be, absolutely. I think that as things have sort of changed, I've started to kind of pivot that conversation a little bit away from this kind of information dump where it's just like, here is who I am, here is my narrative, and moving more into a teacher moment, right? A moment of self-reflection. So ask them to think about, have you ever had a professor who uses a wheelchair before? And if the answer is no, what does that mean? What does that make you think about? What does it mean that maybe you've never had a professor like me? What does it mean that I am maybe a unique experience for you? And should that be the case? Should I be unique in that way? And I think, open that conversation and thinking about how part of my knowledge and part of what I bring to the classroom is derived from professional training. Yes, I have a doctorate. I've done research and things like that. But I think another big part of the knowledge that I bring and experience that I bring is the experience of somebody who has lived on the other side of the normalcy paradigm, that has had the ability to see and to watch the world of normalcy happen from the other side. And that I think I've derived a very interesting mindset, a very interesting perspective on the world as a result of that. And that also is maybe an important type of knowledge, and an important type of knowledge that I want them to start to bring into the classroom too, because I think they also have interesting and important perspectives and viewpoints and positions that are probably not very well represented in a typical university syllabus. And so it becomes really this moment of mutuality, a moment of interrelationship and interdependence, as opposed to just like sort of a pure medical disclosure. And so I think that that's been a thing that has really sort of changed, is thinking about how do I center disability in the class, and how can that also actually open up really interesting conversations, whether or not we're even talking about disability necessarily.
Thank you so much. And I think that to me there are a lot of threads that are coming back to me in terms of also what you were talking about earlier in terms of thinking about the structures and that we're not the problem, right? And that it's really important to question the structures and why it is that we don't have more faculty members, more educators that are in wheelchairs, that are visibly disabled, et cetera, and what is preventing for that to happen. And I think that it's also, for me, calling back to the question of medical gatekeeping within educational structures, especially in relationship to accessibility and accommodations, and how they have clear limits, right, in classrooms and in our teaching, not only for educators, but also for the students themselves. And so in your own work, you highlight that not all limitations are documentable. And conversely, in Teaching to Transgress, Bell Hooks encourages us to use the classroom for transgressing boundaries, to engage students in world making, in imagining otherwise. And in a talk that you offered last year at Western, you challenged us to think of educational spaces as spaces where all of us, students and educators alike, quote, have barriers, things that we are fundamentally not capable of doing unless we change, shift, and revise structures we are in. And so I was wondering if you could talk about what are some of the boundaries you as an educator have transgressed, or as a student in your teaching and in your learning, and why? What have you done differently in your own classes to challenge, shift, and revise those structures that have been really forced into higher education?
Yeah, absolutely. The medical gatekeeping question, I think it's a really important one, and one that I think we all need to take a little moment to step aside and think really critically about. Why do we insist so aggressively and so insistently on medical documentation as being the pivot point to determine who is and isn't worthy of some sort of accommodation or support? And I'm going to reveal, this is my postmodernism coming out. I apologize. Comes out in spurts. But if we think about my experience going through the world of medical gatekeeping, my experience was radically different, I think, than many students, because, as I said, I have a 300-pound disclosure that I'm sitting on at all times. Everywhere I go, I look disabled. And so whether it was in elementary school or in high school or once I got to university, I did not have the same type of surveillance placed upon me that other students do, because I was sort of given this automatic check mark of, yes, he's disabled, without question. Whether that was from administration, whether that was from counselors or accessibility service type folk, or even whether that was doctors. Going to get doctor's notes, for instance, in order to get accommodation because I was sick. It was like, well, yes, of course you're sick, you're disabled. That is not the experience for a lot of people. There are a ton of people in this world in our university system, both as students, but also educators, staff, who have what we would believe to be, or what we might refer to as, quote, legitimate disabilities, that for a whole slew of reasons are not able to get the documentation that we require or that we demand of people. Maybe that is because they don't have access to the doctors to write those types of notes. Maybe they don't have a good relationship with the doctor that they have, and maybe the doctor is a lot more skeptical. Maybe their diagnosis is something that's actually kind of rare, or is subject to a lot of suspicion from the medical practitioners. There's some phenomenal work that's being done in the world of medical bias, both sort of conscious and unconscious bias in the world of healthcare, and how that can lead to specific outcomes, whether it be over labeling of certain types of disabilities, but also under labeling of others. And so when a student arrives to you without paper in hand, it's not as simple as saying, well, they must be faking it, or they must be lying, or they must be trying to gain an advantage. Because in my experience, there are cheaters on both sides of the paradigm. There are people who use their power and privilege in order to get documentation, to get things that maybe, you know, quote unquote, they might not need, as there are many people who have very legitimate needs, in my opinion, who are not given access because they don't have the right paperwork, they don't have the right label that's been given to them. And ultimately, what are labels? They are constructs of medical practice that might be useful in lots of ways, that might have what feels like truth to them, but change rapidly. I say this as someone who has been given multiple labels throughout my life, labels that change as science evolves and we understand and learn new things. And so I think we have to kind of break this notion that there is the deserving of accommodations and the undeserving. And so something that I've been trying to do in my courses is to try and turn on its head the way that I was typically involved or accommodated in school. And the way that I was typically accommodated was by building a second pathway of education. So I needed a keyboard. I had to type my essays and exams, for instance. And so the solution was put Jeff in a different room, have him write a different exam. I couldn't participate in gym. So it was, well, Jeff will have his own gym class. He will do it on his own. And I think that we often have this instinct when it comes to students with disabilities that we like, well, surely we cannot adapt to them in the normal classroom, so we will produce a special classroom for their special needs. And something that I've been trying to do in my courses through my syllabus is to try to open up an educational space that says, perhaps all humans are fundamentally vulnerable and fragile and susceptible to all sorts of types of losses and debilities at all moments. Not to say that everyone is disabled, but to say that a part of being human is to be limited. That's kind of core to our experience. And so what if we approach all of our students as humans, as opposed to as the disabled and the non-disabled student? So that means designing assignments that are flexible, that allow students to play to their strengths. So maybe it's not just write an essay, maybe it's write an essay, but if you're maybe not an essay writer, maybe it is producing a podcast, or maybe it's producing a series of TikTok videos, or perhaps it's about writing music or producing comic books, or doing all of the types of ways that we as humans have learned to communicate, because it turns out there are many of them, and maybe they're all valuable in different ways and in different forms. I similarly I ask myself regularly in my classroom, I have to confront my own internalized ableism, the way that I have to ask myself, am I doing this because I'm following orders? Am I just following rules? Or am I doing this because it makes really good pedagogical sense? And so one of those things that I've done this year, last year at Western, we had a program called SRAs, or the Self-Reported Absences program, which allowed students essentially a 48-hour, no questions asked, no paperwork accommodation for major assignments. That was unfortunately destroyed. It was killed by a revolt of professors who felt that it was unfair, that it was being abused, ellipses, ellipses, ellipses. I thought about it and I realized that, in my opinion, mandating students to get these sort of doctor's notes, forcing them to do that, that to me sounds like just following orders and not actually aligning with my true beliefs. And so what I did for my first year class was I was like, I'm going to continue the SRA. And in fact, I'm going to give you 72 hours instead of 48. And so I set it up on our learning platform. It's just like a little quiz that students could go in when it was time, when they needed an extension, hit the extension button. They knew they had to submit it by 72 hours afterwards, and away we went. And as a result, in a class of 80 students, I had 2 medical accommodations all term, which I think when you look at COVID and cold flus going around and like our entire society crumbling, I think that's pretty impressive, actually. I think that was a win in some ways. And so I think that what I've been trying to think about is that we need to think less about why someone might need help and really actually start to think about what types of help people might need and how can we build those things into the learning space. That's really, I think, what I've tried to have drive all of the decisions I make in my course preparation. And then similarly dealing with students and answering questions on the fly.
Thank you so much. And actually, to that point, a research fellow, Megan Ingram, who's with us here today, created an incredible resource that kind of follows this lead in thinking about the +1 method and really thinking about adaptability and flexibility in our curriculum design. And so I have put a link to this resource in the chat for audience members that would like to think more about what that looks like in your teaching. And, it's interesting because to me, like you're saying that there is a lot of these things that you are implementing in your teaching today that you have been inspired from your own experience as a student, but also influenced by those that you have seen doing this practice. And so in reflecting about your own experience, I'm thinking about one of the chapters in Teaching to Transgress, where the author, Bell Hooks, dedicates a whole chapter on a playful dialogue between herself, Gloria Watkins, and her writing voice, Bell Hooks. And so I would like to invite you to, quote unquote, play a similar game. And wondered if there was a question that your younger self, as a student, as a researcher or instructor, would like to ask your current self, or even your future self, and how you would respond to that question. And I think it might be very beneficial for those junior educators in the virtual room with us today too.
Yeah, yes. This is a tough one. I have a really contentious relationship with both my past and future self, because we are always in a constant struggle for dominance. And so, past Jeff has done all sorts of things to inconvenience present Jeff, and present Jeff is kicking those things down the road to future Jeff as well. So it's a constant struggle of subjectivity and outmaneuverings. But I think I think a question that a young Jeff, sort of early on, we'll say master's level Jeff, just out of undergrad, full of spit and vinegar. I think a question that young Jeff would ask to older Jeff is, what are you doing right now to help more disabled students graduate? What are you doing so that we have more disabled scholars? What are you doing to facilitate that and to make space for that? And I think that I would look back to young Jeff and be like, well, great, thank you for making me look terrible and putting me on the spot. Because as a general optimist, but also an internal critic and a personal pessimist of myself, I don't think I'm doing enough. I don't think I'm doing enough because I think that there's never enough. Unfortunately, I think that sort of every minute of every day could be dedicated to helping that student through who is otherwise going to be blocked by rejection of accommodation, blocked by not having the quote unquote grade average necessary to get in to the school, blocked by policies that are going to result in them not getting into university or college classes in high school, meaning they will be ineligible to get in. Students that will get blocked by funding apparatus like OSAP and ODSP that don't work very well together, that make it very difficult at times to fund going to post-secondary education. And when I look at some of those big questions, well, what have I done today to try and resolve all of those things? Well, I mean, it's only 12:30. I still have some time to fix all of those problems, I suppose. But I think if I'm being kind of gentle and if I'm being sort of more generous to myself, I think one thing that I have done that I am really proud of is the fact that I have a lot of students who come and disclose disability to me in office hours, in sort of informal ways. Students will come and talk to me very directly and say, some of them even saying, you know, I will not tell anyone else this. I'm telling you because I know you're not going to judge me. And I'm telling you because I think you could help. And every single time a student has had that conversation with me that have said, this is my situation and I think I need help, I do, and I will every single time. You know, I often say at talks like this, being disabled can be really isolated at times, not just because your experience can feel very singular and not because the world tells you that your experience is very singular and isolated. But we're also not very good at, I think, networking together at times. I think that disabled populations can kind of exist in silos and that we're not always working together or supporting things that are not directly beneficial to us. And so something that I've really been working on and trying to change in my own thinking is that disability justice is something that affects all of us, and that an injustice for any disabled person is an injustice that maybe isn't experienced directly by me, but is one that I have a role in trying to overcome and to try to make right, to try to find justice for those individuals, even for that individual themselves. And part of that means helping students navigate systems on campus using the power that we have as professors to help them to navigate, being the knowledge holders that can tell them, okay, well, this is where you need to go to book your exams. This is who you need to talk to in order to you know, find the documentation that you require. This is how to contact your MPP to get support in fighting programs like ODSP. Here's who you need to talk to at City Hall if you're having trouble with transportation, to try to raise awareness about these issues. Having people raise their voice, but also being a voice with them. Those are the things that I'm trying to do. And so I think young Jeff would probably not be satisfied. I mean, I'm almost 40 and I haven't fixed the world yet. So I've been slacking a bit maybe, but it's iterative. It's a work in progress.
Absolutely. And I think it's a job that we all have to take part in and actively work on. I think that, you know, I'm thinking of this person who had come to us for consultation here at the Center for Teaching and Learning, and who needed an advocate to help them through one of their classes. And, you know, we started in brainstorming ideas to help them. And there was like a list of, you know, 10 different offices that they could do for, you know, a separate issue, right? And they like that could have been like days of trying to like get in contact with the people, and all of that labor is something that I think is often rendered invisible and ignored. So thank you for reminding us of all of this. And, you know, as a way to, you know, end my part of this conversation and open it up to the rest of the folks here with us today, I wanted to ask you my final question, which is that in her book, Bell Hooks talks about education as the practice of freedom. And so I was wondering what this means to you and what might freedom look like in Jeff's classroom.
Yeah, I love this quote and this concept for a couple of reasons. I think that for a lot of disabled people, for a lot of disabled students, having a classroom that is made for them or is open to them, that is willing to adapt to them, that is willing to give them power and to say, you legitimately and genuinely belong here, that could feel like freedom. That could feel like something that you maybe have not really felt anywhere else in your life, and certainly maybe not anywhere else in the educational world. That access to knowledge, that access to training and skills, I think is just so vital for helping the disabled population to push back against ableism. I mean, as I mentioned earlier with this question of, how many people have had a professor that had a disability and that was sort of open and out about having a disability, part of that is because it's actually very recently that we've actually started to integrate education to allow people like me to get an education. That's actually not an old long-standing thing. This is like a very new thing that our society is undertaking since about like the 1970s, meaning that we're really at the very beginning in some ways of a disability rights movement in Canada. It's been growing for years and years, but there is a whole new wave of people that are bringing incredible ideas and incredible momentum to a bunch of really critical issues faced by disabled people. And it's largely because these were people that had access to an education. They were able to get the language and the tools that they needed in order to make a difference, to be able to challenge power in a way that was effective and also necessary. When I think freedom in my own class, I'm thinking about, so at King's, we operate under a teacher-scholar model, which means that we have a heavier teacher load. So usually I'm teaching 2 classes or 3 classes per term, which is pretty heavy for university, but also part of the reason why I chose King's, because I wanted to be teaching. That's where my passion is. It's where I'm happiest, is in the classroom. And so this term, I'm only teaching 1 class as chair. It's an upper-year course. It's my vanity course, which is DS 3316, Memes and Dreams. And it's all about disability on the internet and internet memes. It's something I love it. I love this class with all my heart. And something that I've been working on this term is trying to, I'm going to use the word flip the classroom, but I don't mean that in the typical CTL way necessarily. Maybe I'm going to say this and then you're going to be like, actually, that's exactly what it means. I'm like, okay, I'm sorry. But I've been trying to flip this class in the sense that rather than thinking of myself as a professor whose job it is to assign tasks and then evaluate tasks and be like, you have done it good. Yes. You have done it bad. No. What I'm trying to do is design all of these assignments in the course that are all building kind of toward a capstone. And at every stage, the comments that I'm giving is intended as dialogue. Because at the end of this class, what I would like is for each one of my students to have one thing that they produced in this class that they are so proud of because they poured themselves into it. Because this was an opportunity for them to tell their ideas and to have their ideas seen as legitimate, but also have been given the support to make those ideas even better, even stronger, even more connected, to try to give them the experience of my favorite part of university, which was getting to the master's and becoming an expert on something myself. And so all of the assignments, I've designed them in such a way that, yes, obviously there's marks, you have to grade things, I roll, but the point isn't the mark. The point here is the conversation that is generated before, during, and after submission, with eyes looking at continuously improving and growing this thing to be the thing that they want it to be. And what that means is that I have to let go. I have to give some power over to them. Because if I wanted them to write, if I wanted them to write an amazing paper about disability online, there's some very specific directions that I would take them. There are things that I think they must write about if you're going to be in this space. But those things might not be the things that light them on fire. Those might not be the things that make them want to wake up and turn their computer on and actually do this work. And so for me, I think freedom in the classroom is trying to move away from these kind of checkbox rigor tests that we're so accustomed to in universities, and starting to think, how can, from week 1 to week 13, how can this be a journey of creation that is genuinely co-created, that is genuinely interdependent? So yeah, they're working with their peers, but they're also working with me as a kind of peer. I think that's the type of teaching that I like to do. That's the type of teaching I want to do. And I think those are the types of projects that, 30, 40 years from now, the student's going to look back on it and be like, man, like the 90 I got in that one class, that's not the thing I remember. It was, I wrote this really strange paper about like TikTok and cognitive dissonance. And that was like the coolest thing I've ever done, I think. That's what I'm aiming for. That's sort of my objective. Because I think ultimately it is saying your voice matters, you have knowledge. And I think that's the thing that we very regularly deny to disabled students and disabled people more broadly.
Thank you so much, Jeff. This was incredible and gives us a lot of food for thought. And so now we're going to